We all know how incredibly important board and superintendent to be on the same page for the district to be successful is for student achievement and student achievement improvement. We're excited to bring you today Dr. William Hughes to discuss how to align those purposes. Bill Hughes is the founder of Hughes Strategic. Since 2018, Hughes Strategic has supported leaders and organizations, especially schools, districts, and networks, to accelerate student achievement, fiscal responsibility, engagement, strategy, and targeted philanthropy. Dr. Hughes is a senior advisor to the School Boards for Academic Excellence and works with schools and think tanks on a range of topics, including educator pipeline, capacity roadmap planning, with a focus on student achievement and successful schools, leaders, development, and board advisor. Formerly superintendent of the Greendale Schools for 16 years, program director with the Kern Family Foundation, focused on K through 12 and higher education leadership development. He's also the co-founder and CAO of Seton. He was the co-founder and CAO of Seton Catholic Schools and the managing director of Leadership with Schools. Leadership with Schools that can Milwaukee. Thank you. That include the redesign of a principal master's degree in education leadership with an MBA. He's active in education policy since 2005, working with the Wisconsin Governor Doyle and Walker. He's a member of governing or advisory boards with government, nonprofits, and foundations, and has worked with Kansas School Board Resource Center, most recently with me on superintendent search. Has been a wonderful strategic advisor for me and for us, and has been just a delight to work with. And I know you're going to enjoy the conversation with Dr. Hughes.
Okay. Thank you, Tracy. So I am going to shift out the presentation a wee bit, and the reason why I'm going to shift it out is a bunch of the slides have been covered around SMART goals, which if you're not using SMART goals, absolutely you need to get your board moving towards SMART goals. And they're actually very helpful in retaining the focus around better academic outcomes for all kids, which is what SBAE stands for. We are absolutely committed to improving student achievement and bringing a focus back on educational outcomes in local school districts. I'm also going to talk a little bit about superintendent evaluation, because one of the things that we are seeing, what's emerging in the work we're doing, is we're not going to be here to provide you with a superintendent evaluation form. That depends on the state and what the board is looking for. But what we are starting to realize is a well thought out evaluation process can actually improve the relationships among the board members and between the board and the leadership team, and especially the superintendent. My background, as Tracy said, is K-12 education for about 32, 34 years. All my work was really focused then to become superintendent of a high-profile school district, teacher in a rural Wisconsin district, actually 2 districts, principal in one of the largest rural school districts in Wisconsin, where we watched the decline of the dairy farm. We thought it was a recession back in the 1980s, but what it was a complete shift in what the culture of the rural Wisconsin was starting to look like. Went from there to one of the wealthiest school districts in the state of Wisconsin, served as part of that district leadership team, and then became superintendent of the Greendale Schools, which is located in southwestern Milwaukee County. And Tracy gave the bio, which is always kind of fancy, but I'm also pleased to be a part of the Greendale Library Board, and it's a village of 14,000 people. So just give you an idea that even after 16 years of service in the district, my wife and I still live in the community and are active in the community, and not so much in the school district, but just there is life after the superintendency, if there's any superintendents left in the room. You have a worksheet. And one of the things that we're going to do today is, and I completely agree with what Michael said this morning, that most PD sucks. It really does. But one of the things that a worksheet can provide is it gives you a bit of a structure to take what we're talking about today back to your district. So on the front, there is a set of boxes around board superintendent relationships. I'm not asking you to fill that out yet, although you may want to flip it over because some of the presentation may start to give you some ideas about here's something that Hughes said that I can take back to my district. On the back, there are 2 questions at the top that I would like you to fill out. The first one is, what phrase comes to mind that describes the board superintendent relationship in your district? A phrase. Second, what does the Board of Education in your district focus on at every meeting? And we're going to come back to both of those as we work our way through the slides. So if you just take a minute, what phrase, what are you focusing on in your meetings? On the slide up there, there's 3 basic outcomes. Sorry for the 1, 1, and 1. They're not all equal. But there's 3 basic outcomes that we're going to be looking at. One is, the main one is connecting you back to the Kansas School Board Resource Center. I know you're all somewhat connected, but the value of collaboration and working together can actually be a lever of change. There are some methods that actually can improve the board superintendent relationship, and we'll talk about that. And then the last piece is a couple of outcomes around academic outcomes. This is a slide I use. Some of you have seen this presentation or a variation of it, have seen this photo before. It's a real photo. Volunteer fire people. It's actually a controlled burn, we know that, but the house is burning down. They're getting their picture taken. They're well-intentioned. The chief is in the middle. There's a photographer. He's got a coat that shows that. That's an analogy for what American public education looks like right now. We got a house fire going on. And people are actually well-intentioned. I believe that at my age. Most of the people who show up every day, who are working in your schools, the people who are advocating for them on all sides, the groups, or what we call the blobs sometimes, the groups that are supporting what the work is, most of them are well-intentioned. They believe in possibilities. They have differences of opinion. They have different views on what education is supposed to be. But there's a house on fire. And it's not a time to get a photograph. It's a time to put the fire out. To sum up, in case anybody else is going to bail between now and 3:15, the golden rule works really good with board superintendent relationships. Treat people the way you want to be treated. And the panel discussion said it better than I can. Find the common ground. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to vote no. But treat people the way you want to be treated. And I've got a slide towards the end, which is called the red line slide. And I stole that slide from somebody down in Chicago in September. And it's like, do you stand above the red line or below the red line? If you're below the red line, you come in with your mind made up. You have your ideology. And you see it's a closed mindset. And that's what some of your opposition looks like. And being on the board, and if you're a superintendent, not necessarily the leadership team, but the superintendent, the CEO of the organization, You don't have that luxury. You need to be able to put what is best in your view for your community. And to synthesize that through discussion at the board level with clear, unambiguous recommendations from the superintendent on every issue. So if you're hiring a superintendent this year, one of the things you should ask him or her is, are you prepared to make a recommendation on every action item that comes forward? And if they hedge, they're not thinking like a CEO. They're actually thinking about what schools used to look like. And that's the fire is part of the reason for that. They're not there to facilitate. They're there to lead. They have people on their leadership team that can help facilitate. So do unto others as you would have them do unto you, or treat people the way you want to be treated. If you look at the worksheet, what did you write down for the phrase? And just shout it out. We're not going to comment on anything, but what was the phrase?
Imperative to student success.
Imperatives to student success. Thank you. Thanks for leading off.
Teamwork makes the dream work.
Teamwork makes the dream work. Great.
Cooperative strategic planning for long-term academic achievement and success.
Good. Academic achievement. Good to hear that. Come on.
I thought it was supposed to be specific to our district.
That's okay. What's for your district?
It's very controversial, adversarial right now.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah. So it doesn't work.
Painful?
Yes.
Painful.
Pretty Little Lies.
Pardon me?
Pretty Little Lies.
Pretty Little Lies. I almost was going to use the song analogy, and I probably should have, but I didn't. Yes, sir.
I got mutually learning with community input. We've got a new superintendent, and we've gone out and talked to a lot of folks and trying to work through it this
Yeah.
year.
Yeah. No fiscal responsibility, which is okay, but we often hear that. Sometimes I hear staff morale. Sometimes I hear books, bathrooms, Title IX, that kind of stuff. Those are all real issues, but I see a little bit of Kansas School Board Resource Center in this room, because somewhere where you are a bit of an outlier from other groups I talk to, you're thinking about kids, academic outcomes. If you're in a tough situation, it's painful, but that also means you're not accepting it, which is actually part of the process you have to go through to get better. If the board and superintendent has a relationship, do they stick together? Not agree, but do they stick together around the controversial decisions? In other words, you have a split vote, 4-3, 3-2, 6-3 if you're a 9-member board, and the superintendent's recommendation may have been upheld, may not have been upheld. Does the team go forward? Not asking for feedback, just something to think about, because in theory, the way the American school boards have been set up since probably the 1800s, and there's really no model out there that is going to replace the American school boards in the foreseeable future. There's been millions of philanthropic dollars spent on trying to figure out different ways to govern American schools. And to date, American Enterprise Institute is probably the one that's gone the deepest on this topic. they pretty much have decided the American school board model actually works about as good as any model in the country. So if you have consultants coming in and going, well, or legislators or politicians saying, you know, we can change up what this looks like, we can bring a nonprofit model, we can bring appointments from the mayor or the county executive or the regional education agencies. A lot of those models have been examined. The way the American education system is set up is it's still set up around a board overseeing a local school district. And schools will continue to be a state function and a state responsibility. For those of you who are Trump supporters or anti-Trump, one of the things that's coming from Washington, D.C., and it's been an agenda item for decades, is to get the federal money back down to the states and back down to the local levels. And what I say to school boards and superintendents in Wisconsin all the time is, don't worry about the future of the U.S. Department of Education. Ain't your problem. You're not going to decide it. Don't worry about, is the U.S. Department of Education being dismantled? The federal funds are on track to flow. There will be some reductions, but at the end of the day, local school boards, with their leadership teams, with input from their community, not just parents, in their community, they will be making decisions and funding will flow. And so it's all about focusing on the local community. And what I like to say to school board members is, your focus is hyper-local focus. That's your pathway forward, and it can actually be a unifier for boards that are in conflict. The whole governance model, the big thing here is, and I'm just going to touch on it briefly, is, and you all know this, board power rests as a board, not in the individual. And whether you agree with your state association or you do not, I'm a bit of a rogue in Wisconsin because I don't fit in with the traditional associations. You're looking at somebody who was part of them and started to see through them. It was actually part of the disillusionment that led me to leave the superintendency. So spent my whole career working towards that goal. Loved it till I didn't. Tracy's heard that line over and over. And then at one point it took me a while to figure out where do I want to go, and I went to ed reform. But even the state associations acknowledge that the board authority rests with the board, not the individuals. The other piece that I think is really important to think about, and we're thinking a lot about this at SBAE, is we think some of the conflict that boards have with superintendents and that boards have within each other is based on governance models. And the associations, and NSBA down to just about every state association in the country, they believe in the Carver board governance model or the policy governance model. And for decades, that was the state-of-the-art policy governance model. But if you look at American history around education, and the legislator gave a pretty nice overview about what Horace Mann and John Dewey were about there. There are other models out there. And NSBA prefers the policy governance model. But, and you know what that looks like. You've got a policy handbook. You plow through it. If you're organized, and you've got a stagnant calendar of reports, you look at the 100 series, the 200 series, the 300 series, you've got a committee working on those policies. You may be paying the association to write those policies for you or to update them. Maybe your attorney's doing it. Maybe you're taking a look at some of the alternatives, like what we offer. Pretty much everything goes to the superintendent. But there's other models. There's a balanced governance model. And that one evolves. And so some of you who may have new superintendents, that's an opportunity. And really good superintendents understand these models. You study these. I actually took this from graduate work that I did in the 90s and updated it. But the balanced governance model is you defer to each other. And you have discussions about how you're doing with the policy administration. Not the updating of the policies, but the management of the school system. One of the things that people often say is superintendents don't want to be micromanaged. Boards also don't like to be micromanaged. One of the things I like to say to boards and superintendents is a wee bit of micromanagement can be a good thing. You just have to know where the balance is and what the give and take is going to look like. Micromanagement model, sometimes from a superintendent's perspective, it's difficult to work in that. If you have a leadership team that is floundering or a superintendent is no longer effective, micromanagement at the board level is going to be probably required. Superintendents and superintendent associations don't like it when I say that. But some kind of oversight has to be put into place there. And then macro management governance model, inert board, largely ceremonial. And I think somebody talked about how they'd had a superintendent for 20 years, inert boards. There's a whole set of research around types of boards, which I'd be happy to talk with people offline about that. But an inert board is same people run for re-election. Oftentimes there's no opposition, or if there is opposition, it's the town crank. It's not going anywhere. And the superintendent and the board put on a bit of a show, and they go through this. The way I look at boards, and what I say is, can you give me your board calendar report? So every year you should be approving a calendar of reports that by month that's going to be presented. And what I say is, can you give me this year's, last year's, 5 years ago, and 10 years ago? If they look pretty much the same, which I'm sorry to say in the district where I live, and it's a protege of mine who is the superintendent, and she's doing a pretty darn good job, I'm pleased to say, they're still using the calendar of reports that we revised in 2009 or 10. They've added a couple. They haven't gotten rid of any, but that's what an inert board looks like. The other piece I want to talk a little bit about is board superintendent authority. And this again should be talked about during the hiring process or during the first year orientation with the superintendent. Your search firm might not, if you're contracting with your search firm to do the coaching of the superintendent, that's something I don't usually recommend, but search firms often are really quick to offer, we can do mentoring and coaching. And oh, by the way, we can also help you with your strategic plan. And by the way, we have a relationship with your superintendent, so we're unbiased, of course, but they're really not. And so think about what the authority looks like. And savvy superintendent candidates ask about this or look for this. And so level 1, complete authority to decide within the limits of the law, board policy. That's the Carver policy model. Superintendent's running the show. It works actually quite good in an inert district. It works good when you're satisfied with the status quo. If you look at level 2, complete authority to act. They're going to own the decisions. They're going to need to be able to explain those decisions either in the evaluation process, on the phone with board members, or at the board table. And they're going to have to be open to feedback when maybe they made a decision that the board doesn't support. And the board needs to be able to look at the superintendent and say, didn't agree with you on that one. And so this is the operation, not the recommendations. This is the day-to-day operation of what the district it looks like. Level 3, prior approval from the school board before executing on all action items. This is getting a little bit into the micromanagement space. So if you have a superintendent that's not performing well, or is on an improvement plan, or is a superintendent that's relatively new and doesn't know your community, and doesn't really understand what the role is yet, or a superintendent that is starting to coast. Level 3, you want to have you know what they're going to be doing around the major items of the work. And the evaluation process lends itself to that. The big thing here is the recommendation piece. If the superintendent makes a recommendation on every action item, even the most difficult ones, that opens the discussion at the meeting for how are you going to implement this. And the superintendent should be prepared to explain what that's going to look like, and the board has the opportunity to give input as the board. And you can do that during the discussion on the action item, or you can do that to amend the motion on the action item. But it's really key to be able to have those discussions. So if you are on a board where your biggest decisions roll through and there's no discussion, or the superintendent says you have agenda item 4.3 before you on the district literacy curriculum, and we're going to adopt the Lexia reading curriculum for the science of reading at a cost of X, and are there any questions? And there's almost no questions. That's a huge decision that board just made. And there's no discussion. And there's no understanding of what the district did from the staff level to make that recommendation to you. And so the whole idea of where these recommendations fit and what the relationship looks like, and if you define relationship as the ability to accomplish a task, which is right out of the Webster's Dictionary. My dissertation was on the approaches superintendents use to establish and maintain relationships with their Board of Education. And we tried to figure out for 6 months what that relationship definition was. And my advisor, who was a legend in the superintendent world back in the 60s, he said, "Did you ever look it up in the dictionary?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Well, get back to me when you've looked up the definition." That was how he brought me along. And it was the ability to accomplish a task. And so the whole idea of being able to hold your superintendent accountable to the big decisions and requiring him or her to explain those decisions in basic terms with pluses and minuses, strengths and weaknesses, deficits or assets, whatever words you want to use, but that they've thought through that decision and they're going to own it. How much authority? Biggest thing here is, and we really talk a lot about this at SBAE, guardrails. Do you know what your guardrails are, what your parameters are as a board member and as a board in your community? Does the superintendent know what their guardrails are in that community? Does the superintendent and or the board president in the evaluation process, and when the board sets its goals, do you talk about what your guardrails are? Or what are your parameters? Or what are your expectations? The hard conversations should get done in closed session, but there should be some open session conversation about what that looks like. so that there is a complete record on what that's going to be. And I tell superintendents, you want those conversations. That puts the board right on the hook with the superintendent, owning what you're going to do and what it's going to look like. And when you have conflict in your boards, the place where you can start to unite around is around better educational outcomes. And we'll say more about that. Goal focus, assessing the relationship. What does the Board of Education in your district focus on at every meeting? Money? How you spend it or not enough? Okay. Buildings. Good. What else?
And just getting past the consent agenda.
Getting past the consent, well, you probably need some board superintendent coaching. And I'm not looking for a job, I do this pro bono, but yeah. But we'll,
Sorry, is it obvious?
I'll get to that. What else? Policy? You mean tripwire policies or the Series 200?
Just rewrites or that
Thank you.
come through the state or other things that we may notice that might need to be amended.
What about student engagement? What about, is the community overall feeling like their aspirations for the kids and families in the community are being thought about in the district? Because that's what school boards are supposed to be doing. And I use the word aspirations intentionally. We all want better for kids. Everybody does. The unifier can be around student achievement. Your biggest detractors, and I'm not talking about the usual people who show up at every board meeting and they've got their time, and what I say to boards is give them in Wisconsin, give them their 3 minutes. Let them have their say, be polite, even if they're not, be generous, move on, go back to, thank you so much for your feedback on whether or not we should be having bathroom changes. So right now, the big thing in the Milwaukee area is there's a bunch of school districts that have electronic passes. And they're tracking how many times kids go to the bathroom. And that's become a huge policy issue. And parents are coming in, students are coming in. What I say is, well, get rid of it. Why do you have it? But my point is, that's a distractor. You're about better educational outcomes and probably financial responsibility. You know what superintendents talk about a lot? And I actually had one who I'd never met. He's not here today, I still would say it. He told me about his bond referendum. Really proud of it. And bond referendum, I passed 5. That's not what you're hired to do. That's part of it. Actually, the bond referendums, that's the board's job to get it through. And the superintendent's there to make sure, to help facilitate, but it's the board members who get that passed. Because they're the ones who are tied into the community groups better. So the big thing to think about is, do you know what the community expects and wants? Not the detractors, not the loudmouths, not the far extremes. What do the majority of the voters want? What does the Board of Education want and expect, and what does the superintendent want and expect? And that gap should be closing over time, not widening. And again, the assessment process is where you can take a look at. Let's see. These are just various aspects and the keys to board superintendent relationships. I want to talk a bit about board superintendent evaluation. Board superintendent evaluation is emerging as one of the biggest issues out there with board governance. And I think a big part of the problem is that the needs in communities are shifting so quickly that the board goals and the superintendent goals, if they're not really written carefully and adjusted yearly, so if you've got the same goals year after year and the superintendent's goals are aligned to that, you're starting to see a breakdown in what the superintendent and the board are going to be working on together. I think you need to think about closed session conversations quarterly. And the board, and I think you should have a basic, simple form, and it's set up around SMART goals with measurable outcomes, primarily focused on educational outcomes, maybe a fiscal goal if you've got a budget problem, although in theory that should go away over time. The board and superintendent should make those hard decisions and close the budget deficit or come up with additional revenue. You may have a short-term goal around community engagement, although that should be a given going on in the community, and that's a board superintendent requirement. And then last but not least, you should probably have a goal around how are we doing, and have a measurement tool that looks like that. It could be a 365, it could be a survey, it could be a narrative that the superintendent prepares, not a dissertation, a narrative, a few specific paragraphs to each goal with data that the board and the superintendent have agreed upon. So the superintendent's got a clear target and the board's got a clear target. What oftentimes superintendent evaluations look like is once a year, often before the board meeting rather than after, so that there's a deadline. I watch superintendents set their evaluation all the time, and if your board meeting is at 6:30, they set it at 5 o'clock or 5:30. Oh, geez, you know, we got to tie this up. We got to get this done. We've got the communities waiting for us. We're starting to think quarterly reviews. So you have 2 formal assessment conversations, maybe in June and January, depending on when the superintendent's contract comes up. But what I'm starting to advocate for is 2 more closed sessions, board superintendent update on evaluation. It fits within the open meeting law language around the country. You have a conversation around here's how we're doing, here's where we need to make adjustments. And what I say to superintendents and board presidents is take a temperature check with each board member. So if you've got troubles within your board and you've got conflict, they have to sit together in closed session and talk about their conflicts. And sometimes that's the board president's job, which isn't going to be too pleasant, to facilitate that conversation. Sometimes it's the superintendent's job to facilitate that conversation. I've even seen attorneys facilitate that conversation. Now, if the board's attorney is sitting with me in the boardroom and we're talking about my evaluation, that's probably not a good sign for the superintendent, right? But it forces the conversations, and it's done in closed session. And then what do you do about the people who leak the information into the community? Who go out after the closed session and talk about it? Bill Hughes did this and Bill Hughes did that and I wasn't happy and I told this and that, and the board president is in the pocket of the superintendent and they're plotting against us. You got to control that board. And that might be a time for the board attorney to come in, not the school board association attorney, the board attorney who's working for the board, to have a conversation about here's what is going wrong. And the reason why we need to change this is because we need to get back to better educational outcomes for our kids, so the kids and families' aspirations are being met and the community is pleased with our performance. And the way I like to say it is, ain't no one can disagree with you on that sentence. If you tie everything back to educational outcomes. So think about that evaluation process. And the other piece that I think is really important is the board's president's role in the evaluation process. Too many boards give up their chance to have feedback directly to the superintendent. They give feedback to the board president, they fill out the form together, and the board president sits down with the superintendent and gives them their evaluation. Is that a part of any of your cultures?
I think we fill them out separate, but we meet together and go over it all.
And then do you go over it with the superintendent together? That's good. What we see in bigger districts oftentimes is the board president meets with the superintendent. And there's a lot of hedging and gray areas that never really get covered in that. And so what I say to superintendents is, don't let that happen. Even though that might make for a less painful evaluation process, you will be able to actually get better feedback and figure out exactly where you fit within that board's perspective on the health of the board superintendent relationship if you sit with the board and you hear the criticism. And the board, you need to be like, Bill Hughes, you've been awful quiet sitting at this table, and I know you're not real happy with me. Tell me what I need to do differently so that I can move back towards satisfactory or a 4 or a 3. And so there's that whole obligation and basic relationships strategies. The other piece that I think is really important is, and we're learning this with the search we're doing. There's nobody here from Chaparral 361. You are. Okay. One of the things we're learning is the pool of superintendent candidates is decreasing exponentially. And one of the things, I do some work around educator pipeline for the state of Wisconsin. And what's happening is the teacher pipeline is starting to fill up again. It's actually, the trend is probably moving in the right direction. The challenge is going to be building principals are leaving in droves and nobody's going into the superintendent prep program. So the pipeline for the top leadership of districts, 5 to 7, 9 years out, is going to be really thin unless we change what that looks like. We can talk about that offline, but what I say to superintendents is, look, if you're in a bad situation and you need 3 more years to get to retirement, go find a different job. The board's job is not to keep that superintendent employed for 3 more years so they can get to the magic number. And there's plenty of jobs out there. The competition for high quality talent has never been higher. And the superintendents, they're a weird group of people. They love, if the good ones really love what they're doing. And so what I say to them is, find a board and a community that you can work with. And they're probably like 20, 30 miles away. And in many states, residency in the community is no longer even a given. It's preferred, but it's not expected. I'm probably the last generation of superintendents where it was part of your contract to live in the community, which did limit the communities that my wife and I were looking at. And, pardon me? The residency? Yeah. And so, but what I absolutely say to people is figure out an exit strategy for everybody if the CEO is not working well with the board. And what we say to board superintendents is you're not going to change that board if they're done with you. And kids' lives are at stake if the relationship is so fractured that you can't make good decisions. Somebody spoke earlier about how do you know around student achievement. And every district has a performance management system. There's some kind of software that you have in your district that is talking to the state agency's software. I'm oversimplifying it, but I'm married to a technology consultant. And it isn't your job as a board member to be able to get in that system and manage it. But it is your job, as part of the evaluation process, to set up fields within that system to kick out data that is specific to your goals. And the superintendent and the director of technology or whoever is managing your tech in your schools should be able to figure that out. They may not want to, but what you want to be able to do is have agreed upon data fields that you're measuring. And one of the things that no one has said here today, but what I would say to you, if you really want to know how well your school district is doing, you want to look at what your demographics, the kids and families' demographics in your community, how well they're doing on student achievement. And are they achieving beyond what their demographics predict? Where their demographics predict? Or below where their demographics predict? So I watch school boards sometimes say, well, we want to be in the top 25 school districts in the state. And if you're in a high poverty district and a small district that has just limitations based on the number of faculty who could, especially at the secondary level, who can deliver the breadth of the curriculum you need to do, unrealistic goal. But you can, and the college board can provide, the college board nonprofit corporation that sells the SAT and the ACT, they can provide you the report that shows where your students are performing to your community's demographics. And that is probably the best indicator of how well your community is doing and how well your school district is doing. And the educators cannot argue with that data. And so you want to be where your demographics predict or above where your demographics predict. You don't want to be below. So the management system is really key. And what you need to do is you need to set that when you set your goals with the superintendent, and you revisit it quarterly with updates. And then you assess it at the end of the year when you finalize the evaluation process with the superintendent. And there should be a conversation around, here's where we hit it, here's where we missed, why did we miss? The superintendent should have some ideas. And the quarterly conversations allow for the changing inputs that are coming in the operation of the district, so that the goals you set in June of 2024, when you're assessing them in June of 2025, and you've had a whole year of whatever is incoming in your community, and the superintendent just couldn't get to those goals, like, geez, you know, I really wanted to get to the attendance goal, but we got distracted with this and that. That's where the quarterly reviews come in that are so helpful. And so you can make adjustments in real time. So the performance management system, always a big believer in that. Financial, the one thing that I would say in big districts, one of the things that is starting to show up is there is a plainly written board report each month presented by the superintendent, not the CFO, in plain language. Here's how we're doing with our budget. Expenditures to revenues. And it's almost like a checkbook. And I'm telling you, CFOs, school business managers don't want to do that. But that simple shift, so what you see in large districts is an Office of Budget Management. In small districts, you see superintendent's report on state of the budget, October, November, December, January. And all you got to look at is, are we on target? Are we over budget? Are we under budget? And I tell superintendents who are interviewing for jobs now, I tell them all the time, you come into your interviews and when you start talking about school finance, you look at the board and go, one of the things I'm going to change on our board agendas is I want to have a superintendent update on the budget every month. And we're going to know exactly where we are. And the reason why you want to do that is there's a number of boards that are spending down their reserves, their fund balance, their savings accounts. And they're doing that to avoid making hard decisions. And I'm willing to bet in Kansas, I know it's true in like 34 of the 50 states, we have declining enrollments going on across section across all demographics. And the only place where student populations are growing are the fast growth states, mainly in the South and the Southwest, for obvious reasons, because families are moving. But the declining enrollment means less revenue. It means that we're going to be shrinking our systems. And it means that boards are going to be making hard decisions. And that monthly board report prepares, from the superintendent's perspective, prepares the board for making those decisions. And if you're spending your reserves down, you're spending down your future. And you're kicking the can down the road. And there is a time to do that, but not to avoid the decisions. And so the Office of Budget Efficiency, or Superintendent's Budget Update. And you don't have the CFO talking in the mumbo jumbo of finance. It's, here's where we are. Fund 10, General Operations Budget. We're 3 months in, and we're at probably about 45% of our budget spent, which would be reasonable, because you spend more of your money at the front end of the school year than the end. But then at the end of the year, there's no surprise that we've spent it down. And if the board is using fund balance to spend it down, one of the things I tell superintendents to do is make sure you have a line like, our fund balance was this last month, now it's this. It's going down. And it makes everybody have to own what that's going to look like. So the big thing is, you're not expected to be a fiscal expert, but as a board member and the superintendent, they should be able to explain to the community, here's how we're doing on our budget. Here's what it's going to look like. And here's what our vision is for that. Clear communication paths, really quickly. How many of you get a call from your superintendent the day of or before the board meeting?
We have an opportunity to meet individually.
And you have to, but the superintendent should check in with every board member before the board meeting. Even if it's a board member, both of you really don't want to be talking to each other. That's the superintendent's responsibility. The other thing is you should have weekly updates, periodic updates. You all get that. Those are all open recordable. Last thing I'll say, because we coming in on time? 5 minutes. Superintendents, this is something I think is really important to note. Superintendent's responsibility is to hear and engage with each board member. The superintendent's job, if the board president isn't doing it, is to make sure everybody gets a voice at the board table. And they need to talk at the board table. The superintendent doesn't have the option of only talking to the people that are in agreement with him or her. This is the red line. Stole this slide. Wish I'd thought it up. How do you enter the room when you sit down as a board member? Are you above the line? You're curious, open, learning, disciplined, and focused on what you believe in? Are you below the line, defensive, closed, and knowing, and committed to being right? Most of your detractors, either at the board level or the community people who show up and bang away at you, they're below the line. You want to get to the above the line. And if you're not focused around student outcomes and better outcomes, you need to really think, why am I spending every other Monday night sitting in these board meetings? And that's part of the conversation in the review. And then boardroom confidence. So if you're working above the line, frame the conversation as the board president. Here's our objective for this meeting or this agenda item. Challenge lazy thinking. Challenge ideology. That's Bill Hughes talking. That's not board governance. If you've got an ideologue sitting on your board, or if you're an ideologue, in other words, you kind of just go along to get along with the prevailing winds of a certain political persuasion, whatever side you're on, that's laziness. It's easy to be an ideologue. 2 of my 3 kids are in politics. 1 of them's an ideologue. And they're real happy there because it's easy. There's other people telling them how to think. And so really think about where you fit there, staying calm. Although if your core values are being violated, there is a red line that you should cross. It's okay to show that you're upset. But you're on the board table. Your job is to stay calm when somebody's ranting and raving at you from the audience. Board president's role is thank you for your input. We're going to get back to our board agenda now. Might take 45 minutes, but you can get back to the agenda. And then lead the conversation. Don't wait for consensus. And I say that to board presidents, and I say that to superintendents. Conflicts, I think we've talked kind of about that already. The dysfunction. A lot of the dysfunction, I think, is starting with the inadequate or incompetence of the superintendent. And a lot of the leadership preparation programs are really starting to shift away from what boards look like now in the 2020s. A lot of the leadership prep programs are really built around the early 2000s, and we're now a quarter of the way into the century. And so part of if you've got conflict going on, some of it is community conflict, but some of it is the tactics and strategies that are being taught don't work in today's environment. And the last thing I would say is education trends can very much be uniters. If there's anybody who is against screen time, reducing screen time in schools, they're just avoiding the hard decision. So look for the trends and use those as uniters. This was the goals stuff, the SMART goals, capacity roadmap. The last thing I would say is your commitment after today. So on the other sheet, the front side, take a look at, if you have a problem, what did this presentation help you think about differently? Questions, and we've got about 15 minutes for questions. I tried to leave enough time for questions.
Tracy.
Just shoot, I'm good.
Well, we've got to use the microphone because we're videoing.
Oh.
Get you on record. You piqued my interest with one of the last comments that you made for people that are against technology in classrooms, that they're avoiding the hard decision down the road. Can you expand on that?
Well, I'm married to somebody who was an assistant superintendent for technology, who then got fed up working with the school district and built a company around delivering technology to school districts, smaller school districts and charter schools. And in Milwaukee, there's faith-based schools and voucher schools. And basically her whole business model was this: you can't afford the kind of talent I can bring to your work. You can't have some, and this was back in the early tech days, somebody who's good with tech who's working on it. Technology, so my bias is she was never a believer in one-to-one laptops or, she recognized that attention span and distractions of technology was going to be a problem. So I've got a bias when I say it, but I think the jury's in. Kids aren't learning for several reasons. One is screen time. One is we've lowered expectations for kids to actually work hard in school. I'm going to step on the tightrope now. We've also lowered expectations for parents. And that parents have a responsibility to make sure they not just gets their kid to school, but that the kid is going to do what they need to do in the school. And I'm the first one to say parents are different now, and I'm in schools about every other week, so I see what school, I'm not working in the ozone. And so the screen time is a huge problem, and I also think the idea that, well, we need to be in touch with our kids 4 or 5 times during the day to make sure that my child is doing okay, that's a shift in culture that maybe at the board level you need to have a conversation about that. And then you go back to the superintendent and say, in smaller districts, I need you to go out into the community and find out, is this what the community wants in their schools? That, parents are texting their kid 5 or 6 times a day. Or their kid texts their mom or their dad or step-parent and Mr. Travert was really mean to me in class, and before the class is over, the parents calling the principal up or calling a board member and raising Cain about that. I mean, that is a shift in what education looks like. I think the other problem we've got, and I think I can say it in this room, is, and I'd love to take credit for this quote, Andy Rotherham, who is a partner with Bellwether Education Consultants. If you're not following Bellwether Education Partners, classic, big, DC, well-to-do think tank on education, they actually do some pretty good work. Andy Rotherham said, isn't it interesting that the people, and Andy is a Democrat, Andy said, isn't it, just this week, isn't it interesting that the very people who are against RFK Jr. on all the health stuff are the same people who are happy with the direction of the American public schools. And what we actually need is we need a disruptor, and I don't agree with RFK Jr., I'll tell you that. I think we're going in not a great direction there, but nobody cares what I think. But we have an education establishment that says, give us more money, tell us, we will tell you what to do on what education looks like. The superintendent as a professional advisor, which was how I was trained in the 90s, which is no longer the model, but we have that dichotomy. And so that's where I think the screen time thing is. If your district hasn't banned screen time or reduce screen time in classrooms, you should. The state shouldn't have to come in and pass a law to do it because the local school board's afraid to do it. The research has been figured out. Jonathan Haidt was right. Let's move on. It's sort of like the bathrooms. It's sort of like the books, right? It's like, move on, make the decision, let the people who are going to bark at you in your meetings, let them bark and say, thank you so much, we appreciate it, but we're going back to our agenda. And I believe, except in a few communities, most communities are tired of that kind of back and forth, and they're looking for their boards, and what I say to superintendents, they're looking for their CEO to take a stand and basically say, enough already. We solved the bathroom issue. We're moving on. And the unsaid thing is, if you don't like it, kick Bill Hughes out as superintendent, kick Tracy Frederick out as the board member, and put somebody in. And if you can't win, we still live in an American republic, right? So does that answer your question on screen time? So do kids need to know how to use laptops? I think most of them do. But we need, Michael was spot on. We need to be linking content directly to what kids are learning. And that has been a loss really in the last 10 to 15 years. That's just sort of disappeared.
No questions.
What other questions? So board presidents, how many of, okay, go ahead. I was going to ask my own question.
Dr. Hughes.
Call me Bill.
Bill. How much do you charge to come and speak so we can get you back?
Actually, I expenses.
Okay.
And because, and I could get me down to Kansas. It took me 9 hours to get here from Chicago by air. And an hour and a half in the plane. But United Airlines to Salina is kind of an interesting ride. I'm hoping I get home tomorrow.
You probably went to Denver and then down to Dallas before you came.
No, we just moved gates in Chicago. But I'd be happy to do a webinar with you, and I'm good at doing virtual. Tracy will tell you, I can do virtual and make it pretty good. I see it as a gift to be able to come and talk to you about this stuff. It's sort of full circle for me. I left public schools in 2012. I wasn't disillusioned, I was done.
Yeah.
And I went to work in ed reform and spent 10 years working in the lowest income schools in Milwaukee and then around the country, building out a leadership prep program. And the SBAE thing has sort of brought me back to the board governance stuff. And I actually think, Dave was part of the start of SBAE. And there's some other groups out there that it's not just SBAE, but there is a realization in the philanthropic community that the change is going to have to be at the community and the board level. And it's really about how do you get boards to refocus, get off the ideology stuff, regardless of what side you're on, get back to educational outcomes. My belief also is fiscal responsibility. You're going to have to do more with less. I mean, until we get another baby boom, it's going to look different. And a lot of the ed establishment don't want to hear that. They just want you to pour more money in. At the local level, you just have got to figure it out.
Yeah, you just hit on so many points that's where we're at in Kansas. We're actually in an RFP for a search committee for a new commissioner. We have issues with teachers retiring early, the tech in the classroom issue, the ideology things, and then just status quo that is really, it's like, I have a medical background, so I use the word constipation. If that is a problem, then you need a cathartic.
Yeah. Well, and think about it this way.
Sorry.
And I say this to boards, not generally rooms I don't know. and I show my age, you're fighting the education establishment. The education establishment doesn't want to change. I was on track to be president of AASA. That's not the executive director's job. That's a cake eater's job. I was just on track to get elected by my peers to be president of AASA in about 2008. And the superintendent who hired me, brought me to the Milwaukee area, he's now my dear friend, 89 years old, still involved a little bit in Wisconsin education. He has helped like 7 Wisconsin superintendents become president of AASA. I had to sit down with him and say, I don't want to do that. And he's my best friend now. And I didn't want to do it because it's all part of the establishment, and I was chafing under a lot of different issues about the education establishment. And then when I was working with Governor Walker, I realized where the type of reform you had to have to, I mean, you've got to rip the Band-Aid off, rip the scab off the cut. And the ed establishment doesn't want to do that because they're going to lose their jobs. And those are great jobs. And so you just need to be thinking about that you're pushing the boulder up the hill, to use the parable, and it's not going to be easy. And you've got to find people who you can talk to who know what you're going through, which is the whole idea of the collaboration.
Another question.
Board president, how many of you are board presidents? And do you get elected by a united vote, or is it divided? How many are 5-0, 7-0? And is that the real vote? Or is that the vote for the public?
I was the only one willing to do that.
Do you get paid another $100 a meeting or $100 a month? Well, the board president, and that's actually something where I'm starting to play around with, is the board president might actually be one of the key factors in whether or not you have an effective board. And I don't know if there's a lot of research out there on that. If you haven't read the book, there was a webinar. I'll send it to Tracy and David so you can get it. But there's a book out about all adult needs are being met. The kids aren't. And they're talking a lot about board governance again. SBAE helped sponsor this webinar, so it's a little more focused on probably what you're all interested in. But I think the board president actually might be the unknown factor that people aren't thinking about. And that board superintendent evaluation process, I think you should be at least having discussions twice a year and probably quarterly with your superintendent about, are they on track on the goals, and where do we need to make adjustments? And you can get at some of your relationship issues.
Anything else? Oh,
yeah.
As a board president, you mentioned about lead the discussion, don't wait for consensus.
Yeah.
Was one of your points.
Yeah.
I feel that I do a good job of leading the discussion, but I also try to build the consensus. Let everyone speak their mind. If I notice someone's a little grumpy or whatever, is that part of my role?
Yeah.
Is to build that consensus so they're all on the same page? I feel like it is.
Yeah, and I think if you have, if Bill Hughes is sitting on your board and is tail gunning the superintendent and tail gunning a bunch of issues, and you've got one of those issues that comes up and Hughes sits there and doesn't say a word, I think it's your job as the board president to say, you know, depending on how you, board member Hughes, Mr. Hughes, Bill, I mean, you can have, it depends on what the board culture is, on how you operate, but Bill, what do you think about this? We know you have feelings about that. And force that person to own it and say it at the table. Because tail gunning is tail gunning. It's easy to tail gun without looking somebody in the eye. And so I really am a believer in that's where the board president can do it. And what I say to superintendents is if you got a board president that won't do that, you either need to cultivate another board member who will say it, kind of the rogue or the one that's out there that will do that. And if they won't do it, the superintendent should do it. And that's tightrope walking for the superintendent. But in today's job market for superintendents, I'm like I said at the front end, don't stay in a job where they don't want you, or you can't be successful, because you can change districts, probably get a raise, and find a board that wants to work with you at least for the first couple of years, and you can get back to the magic of actually doing what you're doing in education. And so it's all about the relationships. And like I said, look it up in the dictionary. It's the ability to accomplish a task. 6 months of work. Wish I'd looked it up earlier.
Thank you, Bill.